Okay, thanks. I assume if you can't hear me, that you'll let Matt know and he'll let me know if there's some problem with the audio. As I said, I'm going to cover this topic at the conference a bit in more detail, but I do want to go through it. I want to talk about both the CPAD data, which I'll describe in a second, the fee-owned lands, as well as our new easement data set. I did mention about GreenInfo Network, the nonprofit. We work for lots of other public interest groups and public agencies. A lot of it in California, but a lot of it all over the U.S. This was sort of the most important thing I think I could say, which is if you have a question about this data set, go to calands.org, and it's a very robust data site. We like to pride ourselves that it's the most detailed data site for any GIS data set in the state, maybe even in the U.S., and there are a lot of resources here. The other thing I want to say is definitely sign up for the e-news. It comes out a couple times a year. It's the way you find out when there is new releases of the CPAD or the new easement data set. The newsletter is very light. It's not a long, complicated thing, and it's very useful to get. So what's in CPAD, which is one of the two data sets in hand here? One deals with fee-owned lands that are held for open space purpose. The other that I'll talk about later, CCED, deals with easement lands. The kind of lands that are in CPAD range from little tiny urban parks all the way up to great big stuff. We've taken an approach of having a very comprehensive data set that includes just about anything you could think of as open space. There's some questions about the term protected, because we don't mean that it's all protected purely for biodiversity. We mean that it's primarily managed for a range of open space purposes, some of which could include forestry and other extractive uses. We do not include public land generally. This is not a public land data set, so things like you see here are not in there. We also do not include military lands, although there's collateral data for that. And we don't include tribal lands unless we know they're affirmatively protected as open space. The database itself is quite large. It's really the most robust data set of its kind in the country. There's 49 million acres. The most interesting statistic to me is this one here. There are 1,000 agencies represented in the CPAD data set. That's, I'm always kind of amazed when we add that number up, but it's a very, very good data set. There will be a new version coming out, a minor release next week, and we will be letting the newsletter list and many other lists know that. We try to map most of CPAD to assessors parcels, and I'll say a little bit about that later. It's a standard that generally works certainly in the metropolitan areas. Rural areas a little different. The stats on CPAD are really what's shown here. I'm not going to try to go through them, but I will point out that obviously a few agencies own most of the public land in California, open space land. A great many other agencies, cities and park and rec districts, own a huge number of the units. Think of them as parks. So each of those are important for different reasons. If we take a visual of what we're trying to create, this was data from some number of years back that was indicating what land was protected back when we had USGS quads and not much else to work with. If we look at what was really there at the time, this is what the data was. And the difference has largely been the parcels. Having digital parcels now for all of the state and being able to access them has meant that we can take this kind of accuracy and extend it. We're still working on getting all of CPAD to align. Not all parts of it do, but most of it does in fact align. Another way to look at why a really good inventory matters is this was an earlier data exercise the state did in 2005 in an area north of San Diego as part of a statewide data set. But what was really there was this, and this includes both the lands in fee and the easement lands. Knowing whether we have the full inventory of lands that are protected for open space really matters. It creates a very different look for the planning landscape and the project mitigation landscape and a lot of other factors. If we look at where CPAD came from, GreenInfo developed it from regional data sets that it worked on starting in the Bay Area, really back into the late 1990s. And only in 2008 could we get a chance at a statewide database mostly by little bits of funding from all sorts of different partners. There was never any ongoing funding for statewide work to really bring the data set up. A little over a year ago, we were able to get funding from the Strategic Growth Council for about 20 months, and that let us really improve the data set an awful lot. It let us do a lot more outreach to educate users, and it helped us build systems that will hopefully make the data much more efficient over time. We also believe that, and I'll talk about this later, that we will in fact get ongoing state funding now to keep it up, and that'll be just a great thing. It's a relatively inexpensive data set for such a widely used statewide data set. For the GIS types among you, the way the data is structured is sort of like this. There are these three types of features. The holdings are kind of the atomic level. Think of them as literally atoms, and they aggregate into molecules. And the molecules are really the things that we would call the Jones Regional Preserve or Kennedy Park, each of which could be made up of multiple holdings. The advantage of that is over time we can track changes and show improvements. We can also handle different management designations that are not always done at this level of accuracy. CPAD has a bunch of attributes. It's not deep on attributes, but the designation, what the park is used for, or the open space, who owns it, what its access is it open, closed, or restricted? All of those things are in there and are very, very useful for a lot of things. If we look at how this structure works when we actually go to see it on the ground, here's an example of Henrico State Park in the Bay Area. The holdings level of Henrico looks like this. It's made up of 156 separate parcels. If we aggregate those broken by county, we get 2 units. And if we aggregate it by the broad name, we get 1. We call that a super unit. Issues in the data set, parcel data in rural areas is not always accurate, and source agency data, especially for federal agencies, can sometimes be aligned differently. That's an ongoing state issue that Nate, I know, will talk about at the next webinar, because through UC Davis, the state is getting close to having a reasonable statewide data set for parcels. There are also questions of knowing who owns and who manages. Those are two different notions. CPAD is based on ownership, but includes where someone else manages when we know it. One of our biggest challenges is just how we connect to these 1,000 agencies, and I'll talk a little bit more about the strategy for that in just a second. There are some other minor things. I'm not going to try to get heavily into these. How we connect to those who are doing their own regional data aggregation is very important to us, because we want to find an efficient way to do all that. And finally, there's all sorts of esoteric things like homeowners associations and other holders of land that falls into the ambit of CPAD, and we're learning how to address those. CPAD is part of the National Protected Areas Database of the U.S., created by the USGS GAP program. It is essentially the California element of that national data set, and we are working closely to get better relationships over time. We work very closely with the GAP program, and they use us as kind of a pilot for a lot of things. If we look at how CPAD is best used, these are really the key things. It's primarily for multi-jurisdictional planning efforts. Any individual city or even a county might have a really good source of its own data, although it's surprising how many do not. But anytime more than one jurisdiction is involved, CPAD is a terrific resource. We always point out that, of course, we don't replace source agency data. If you want the latest and greatest, you have to look at those, but at least you can find all the source agencies in an area. These are just a wide range of uses of CPAD data, and they go from broad general planning use all the way to things like Megan's Law, where the question is, well, if there are restrictions where certain offenders can only be so far from parks or schools, how do you get that data? Well, CPAD provides that framework for that kind of thinking. And I say that not to dwell on it, but to indicate that this is a data set with a wide range of uses. I'm going to very quickly run through a few maps that just show how it gets used in practical terms. This is trail planning on the left, biodiversity conservation on the right. The State Parks Department has made heavy use of it in qualifying people for park bond grants, and there's an application we built for them that helps create these metrics for any particular area. The metrics are only possible if you have good data like CPAD. People have used it for determining park poor areas. That work can be simple, as in the first image, or it can be more complicated, as in these images here. It's used for a variety of other purposes, whether it's recreation or integrated water management, any number of other purposes, conservation planning, all these things. Let me quickly move to conservation easement database. Most of us know land can be owned in fee or it can be held under easement. The conservation easement database focuses on land that is in conservation easement. And as I said before, this area that we looked at previously had this much protected land, of which this much was in easement. So easements in some parts of the state are very, very extensive, not all parts of the state. The kinds of easements we are interested in CCED, the California Conservation Easement Database, are these, not other kinds. And we're mainly looking at those that are held by agencies and land trusts, along with a few others. The basic stats on CPAD I'll get to in a second, but just like CPAD and PAD-US, CCED is related to the National Conservation Easement Database, which is organized by several nonprofits. It's essentially the California contribution to that data. The data that we're going to release probably next week for the first time will include about 1.5 million acres of land area by a little less than 100 agencies and land trusts. One of the things about easements is multiple easements can be held on the same property. So there's actually about 1.7 million acres in the new CCD, but only 1.5 million acres of footprint. There are a lot of issues around easements that are very different than the fee lands, and we've wrestled through a lot of those. Easements are public records data, but because they involve private owners, there is sensitivity around privacy. We've developed some very strict guidelines that we think will ease everybody's concerns about anything that might come up. That we, in fact, have seen no evidence that any data around easements has been misused where it has been available, and it has been available in many places. Nonetheless, there are some issues. Let me wrap up with two things, just this couple slides and then a very quick web demo of something. We think we're going to get funding from the Resources Agency to continue this work. We have lots of things we want to do, and we welcome your input on it. There are ways you can contribute your thinking using the survey at CA Lands, emailing us, just finding some way to get in touch. But did I mention sign up for the newsletter? Definitely go to the website and just click on the little subscribe button and fill out the form, and you'll stay up to date on all of this. I'm Larry Orman, larry@greeninfo.org. You can send CPAD-related email to cpad@calands.org. There'll be an equivalent email address for CCED. Let me just briefly, without going into any great detail, point out the CA Lands website. That website will be slightly different. It'll be called a more general term when CCD comes out, but it's basically the same thing. The thing I want to point out is that we have a tool that allows people to propose revisions to CPAD, and it's a very useful tool. It's called Map Collaborator, and it's a basic application that GreenInfo has developed that allows any user to choose a location, select the kind of lands that they want to review. Let me say I want to review those for Anaheim. I can call up all of Anaheim's data quickly. I can pick any one. I can export a list if I want, but I can choose to go to Barton Park, for example. And in Barton Park, if I decide that there's really something here that isn't quite right, I can add a note to it by simply starting here and pinning a note. I fill out a form saying what I think the issue is, and I post it to the site. Like a wiki, that note stays on the site. Everybody can see that. If somebody finds issues that have already been addressed, then you'll know that. You can also draw things, and let's just say that redevelopment was still with us and somebody was, God forbid, going to take out all these houses and add to the park. You could add that as a polygon and provide that information to us. These are recommendations to GreenInfo of changes that should occur. Finally, you can upload shapefiles or KMLs directly onto the map. This whole system is managed in a database that allows us to accept or decline different recommendations that are made. It's also an application that's been used for many different purposes. SCAG is using it now to monitor a variety of plans. The Federal National Park Service is using it for land water conservation grant tracking. We're doing school boundary development with it. It's got a wide range of purposes. But from CPAD's point of view, I would say find a way to go there, find your agency, call up what's in CPAD, and tell us whether we got it right or wrong. You can use the online tools, or if you need to, you can email us something, or you can just upload your own data to us. It's a terrifically useful framework for all of those agencies that we have a hard time relating to, just because there's so many of them. We can't possibly talk to 1,000 agencies in any regular basis, but we can invite them to contribute to CPAD here. Last little thing I'll mention is there is a public access site for the CPAD data that includes the lands that are open to the public or those that require a permit. And you can simply browse in here. It's got some very nice cartography and features. You can pull up a particular site and find directions to it. You can also get this kind of bird's eye view in which you can really see what's on the site. This is kind of a nice feature to investigate or things, and you can plan trips from here. It's a really good public access framework that's combined with this kind of imagery to make it very useful. That's it. Matt, I'm over to you.
All right. We had a couple questions here. The first one, and anybody else who would like to jump in with a question, please type it in the box. First one is, are these data available as web services?
Yes, they are. And I say that with a little bit of a caveat. They are web services, and you can see here that you can log on to those at the California GeoPortal. The web service that's being used at the GeoPortal is a little bit limited. It definitely, you have to accept the feature classifications that we have there. But it is a web service, and it's available in KML and for ArcGIS Explorer and all these other formats as well. So just go to CPAD data and you'll find that. And those will update next week when we release the new data. These current links are not quite working because we're just in the process of uploading new data to the site.
Okay, let's see here. Another question is, how many people do you have working on data maintenance?
As many as we get funded for. In general, we have had for the last year and a half the equivalent of about $125,000 or $135,000 a year of support. That essentially gets us a person or two at most to work during that time, and we try to keep up with data wherever we can. We expect that new funding will keep us at about that level. We'd love to have more, but we also know that the state is still not fully out of its financial box. But frankly, we stretch money and make it go a long ways. So that lets us keep up pretty well. And again, we just need collaborators to use our revision process and tell us how we're doing. But it's not a big operation.
Okay. Well, is anybody else, any other questions? It looks like there's none at the moment. So, Larry, I would like to thank you so